Good evening, everyone. My name is Rob Vitesi. I'm an Enterprise Professor in Water Resources at the University of Melbourne, and it's a pleasure to invite you to our Water Security Seminar series. Before I go any further, I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people, and in so doing pay my respects to all the elders past and present. Got a great lineup today to talk about the Melbourne Healthy Waterways strategy. We've got 5 great speakers and an opportunity for you to quiz them with questions. Now, this event tonight is actually part of a series. I know many of you have been to some of the earlier seminars that we've had in the series, but this is part of a pattern, I guess. What we're trying to do at the University of Melbourne is to bring academia and communities and industry leaders together to raise understanding about different aspects of water security. We regard it as an existential challenge for humanity. We're nowhere near as bad off as many other people in the world are, but we do have plenty of water challenges. And they're only getting harder because of population growth and climate change and changing societal expectations of reliability and quality of water. And this is why the work that's being done here in Melbourne around the Healthy Waterways strategy is so important. It's a vital piece of work insofar as the waterways of our region are amongst us. We all live amongst these waterways. They're a very important part of our lives. Even though they're highly modified, they still have significant ecologic value, and we want to improve that. But most people in Melbourne, we know this from survey, really do want to enhance the amenity value of these waterways as well. So this is actually a dimension of water security. It's not just about reliable potable water supply, it's about other aspects of how water enriches our lives. And so we're going to hear some great perspectives. We've got 5 speakers, as I've mentioned. We have Gerald Fitzgibbon from Melbourne Water, an executive there. We have Rosemary Hancock from the Municipal Association of Victoria. We have Amber Perry from DELP, and we have Michelle Dixon from Blue Sense Consulting, and finally Tim Fletcher from the University of Melbourne, and they'll each give a particular perspective on the Healthy Waterway strategy. I'm going to begin by introducing our first speaker, who's Gerald Fitzgibbon. So Gerald is a graduate of the University of Melbourne Civil Engineering School. Well done. With over 30 years' experience working in both the private and the public water sectors. He's led teams across the world, and not only in Australia, but also Asia and North America, and played a big role in business transformation, operations management, and business development. His career has given him technical and commercial experience in the planning, design, and construction of municipal and industrial water, wastewater, and drainage systems. And the reason he's speaking today and setting the scene for us all on this topic is that Gerald is the point man in Melbourne Water that has engaged the other speakers today and myself as chair of the regional leadership group to develop and prosecute the Melbourne Healthy Waterway strategy. So with no further ado, Gerald, I invite you to the podium to give your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rob, and good evening, everybody. Welcome. What a fabulous venue this is. As Rob pointed out, I'm not an aquatic specialist. I'm not a waterway strategist. I'm not a biologist, but I have been given custody of the implementation of this strategy. So that's the pointy end of proceedings. So I just wanted to give you an overview of where we've come to date, what the strategy implementation looks like, and then I'll hand it over to the balance of our speakers to take you through some of the details. So, apologies, a lot of detail, a lot of small words, but it's also a useful prompt for me. So, at the moment, we are, as I said, in the implementation stage. We are working out what do we need to get in place, what change management do we need to set up, what changes do we need to make in terms of co-delivery of what has been a fabulous co-design exercise. So way back in the beginning, the Healthy Waterways strategy, I mean, the last Healthy Waterways strategy was developed back in the early 21st century. And the original vision in those days was that when waterways were valued, were healthy, there was local amenity encapsulated in some of the projects, but it was very much done on a catchment by catchment basis. There wasn't a global view across certainly the 5 catchments of Melbourne, and there wasn't a vision around what values and what conditions will be required to enable a change in the performance and health of those catchments. So a refresh was proposed about 2 years ago. Melbourne Water pulled together a team under its integrated planning group. We reached out and developed across a range of stakeholders a couple of key teams, both from the scientific community, academia, and also our own colleagues and stakeholders across Parks Victoria, DELPS, and the Municipal Council. So it was a big team co-design exercise. The focus this time round was looking at what are the threats, what are the opportunities, what has shifted in the world that we live in that is a potential threat to the health of waterways, and most importantly, what levers do we have at our disposal to mitigate the deleterious effects of modern issues. And right up front, surprise, surprise, as climate change and urbanisation. At the moment, we are heading into a very dry part of the water cycle. We've just come out of a relatively damp one, but the general trend, as we are all aware in this room, is that things are getting drier. However, back in December 2016, we ended up with a tropical downpour, which produced flash flooding across much of Melbourne. So we're both entering into a drying climate, but also being exposed to more flashy floods, which is playing havoc with our waterways. So that's a key element and consideration and part of this. We're also growing at 10,000 residents per year. Urbanisation is a big issue, clearly. This strategy thinks about social values, the amenity of our waterways, lifestyles, our connection and need to be adjacent to or at least close to green space, fresh space, water-driven space. Aboriginal values. The traditional owners place incredible importance on waterways as a source of amenity, but also traditionally, of course, a source of food. And their role in this strategy was very important in terms of getting their involvement and getting their perspective. As I mentioned, stormwater is a massive issue. We're not only having to look at ways of mitigating the flushing effect of more urbanisation, but also to potentially use stormwater as a means of maintaining some streams in a healthy space. And finally, and most importantly, Melbourne Water's original Healthy Waterways strategy was done in a partially collaborative way with stakeholders. This strategy wraps its arms around all stakeholders as a means of co-delivery. Melbourne Water could never do what we've proposed to do in this strategy by itself. This strategy's success is founded on co-delivery, which means all of us, all the key partners, parks, the municipalities, DELP, a range of community groups, as well as Melbourne Water, working together in a coordinated program of work. To do that, we've applied a different model. It's a model that's been used in the States, but also around about, and it's really founded on the idea that success can only be achieved if 5 key elements are put in place. And we all know the stories around working across organisations, the issues of silos, the issues of local politics. We've embedded, and it's been a big focus for Melbourne Water, and me in particular, to make sure that we get these enabling elements in place to give this strategy the best chance of success in implementation. A common agenda. So a shared vision for change, a shared vision about what needs to be done and how. So that is the strategy. This is a big shift. Shared measurement, understanding what data we need to collect, both operationally, so year by year, longer term, measured in decades long, to make sure that we are achieving outcomes that will enable an improvement in the conditions, which will improve realise the performance objectives, which will shift the values and the condition of those waterways. easy said. There's a hell of a lot of work happening right now in defining shared measurement, how we do that, and how we get our arms around all the players so that we share and measure in the same way and we have same conversations about what outcomes are being delivered. Mutually reinforcing activities, so that's clearly consistent managed program work across the partners. So that's a big shift, and that's going to be a challenge, but that's ultimately the measure of success. We don't want to be falling over each other. Conversely, we don't want to be leaving gaps in critical catchments and subcatchments. Communication, that's a given, but most importantly, dedicated backbone support. Traditionally, a lot of these strategies, everybody sits around, we all agree, yep, that's fabulous, let's go for it. Everybody goes back to their own quarters, and things don't necessarily get done as intended. The shift this time is to provide a backbone of technical and facilitative support to keep the culture of this collective and co-delivery alive and kicking through, not through the years, but measured in decades. The shared measurement, I just want to quickly talk about that. So it's a MERI, wonderful acronym that most of you will have heard of: monitoring, evaluation, reporting and improvement. Clarity around what we measure, the frequency we measure it, making sure that across the various partner organisations we do that in a consistent way is vital. If we can't get that done, we are not going to be successful. We need to be having a data-focused, data-driven conversation about what's working and what's not. This, in essence, is an adaptive strategy over the decades. It's going to need to change. We have a starting place now. By the end of it, and certainly after the first decade, I would imagine that this strategy and the delivery of these outcomes will have shifted a lot, and technology will be part of that. The focus on reporting and how we drive governance to keep us all accountable for what we've committed to in this strategy is vital. And traditionally, a lot of these strategies fail on that point. Keeping ourselves collectively and individually accountable. So, from a governance perspective, we will have a regional leadership group, which is not unlike a board, which will be made up of members of some of the key delivery partners. There'll be traditional owners involved, community reps, a rep from the CMA, Melbourne Water, of course, EPA, Parks Victoria, MAV, Municipal Association of Victoria, and DELP on this board to making sure that their respective organisations are accountable for the commitments made as part of this strategy. It only works if you've got hard data to have a hard conversation when things are going off track, as they will. That leadership group will be supported by this backbone team that I mentioned, which we will have a supporting implementation team and some functions which will be supporting around the facilitation of workshops and engagement with the community about progress, but also capturing feedback from the community as we move through the program across the 5 catchments and the 69 subcatchments. Data is vital here, and as I said, this is the big shift. The traditional approach was, we know roughly what we need to do, let's throw money at it and good things will happen. The difference now is good things will happen if we're measuring them and can define them and feed that back into a loop. So as I said, I'm a civil engineer, but we're applying the simple philosophy of built assets to the natural asset base. And while not easy, it's starting to be done, and that, I'm convinced, is the secret for success. These are our important natural assets. Let's treat them like we treat all our other assets, with data and with continuous improvement and feedback. And the accountability piece is the engine, is the recipe for success. So, it's a big shift. It's ultimately the biggest change management exercise that I think we've all done in the waterway space. The current state is the idea that Melbourne Water is perceived as the owner of the strategy. Well, we have accountability for keeping the strategy moving, but it's not our strategy, it's everybody's strategy in that regard. Melbourne Water traditionally used partners and took on services and had an ad hoc co-design and co-delivery of specific projects. There wasn't a global multi-catchment view. It's a big shift. Traditionally, no annual targets to move towards in terms of shifting condition of assets, in terms of shifting the performance and therefore the values and ultimately the condition of the waterways and the values that are derived from them. And typically delivery was operationally not locally focused, not strategic. So the shift now is we have shared ownership of the Healthy Waterways strategy with the key partners that I mentioned. Collaboration on key system issues and planning and responses, strategic goals and targets. If there are issues that come out of one subcatchment where there are learnings potentially applicable for the entire fleet of catchments, the whole point of this new structure is to share that information. The whole point of this new structure is to make sure that the community, and there'll be 5 regional implementation forums to allow the community to engage, not only in terms of getting information, but also to provide feedback. We see that as happening on a regular basis, a number of times a year. And then finally, the shift to the future state is a clear line of sight between what's proposed, how we're delivering it, what the data's telling us, if we're winning or not, and if it's not, what are we doing differently to change? So what does success look like? Success looks like 5 catchments with collaborative forum partners working together on achieving the performance objectives over the decades, not over the years, not over the financial year, over the decades. So this is ambitious. There'll be sub-catchment collaboration groups such as the Moonee Ponds Creek project, which is an example where many of the key players are brought together, where we've got a common approach to planning, system, regulatory tools. There are litter programs involved, but also there's the amenity around transport, trails, connectivity to projects to help community connect to waterways. That's an example of bringing these multifaceted approaches to these projects, which are programs, which have a decade long. So, sounds easy, right? It'll be a challenge, but the point is, and one of the reasons why there's been so much effort in the co-design is that co-delivery is success. And without co-delivery, this isn't going to work. So we're all looking forward to embracing that new way of working. So I'd like to hand you over now to Amber, take you through some of the details.
Great, thank you, Gerald. So Amber Perry from DELP. Amber's got 17 years experience as a water and catchment management professional, working both in Victoria and Queensland over the years. She successfully led a range of programs in the areas of policy, science, stakeholder and community engagement. Amber's currently the Manager for Policy and Strategy within the Waterways Program branch of the Victorian Department of DELP. And in that role, she leads the team responsible for statewide strategies, policies and programs that improve the waterway health across Victoria. We thought it'd be really good to have Amber speak to us today to put the Healthy Waterways strategy within the overall state context. So Amber, welcome, and please...
Hello everyone. So I'll start with the challenge, because I think that really plays into why there's a role for government as well as a role for Melbourne Water, as well as a role for a whole range of other organisations in this space. So we have a huge challenge on our hands for this region, across a whole range of areas, including managing the health of our waterways. You may have seen this graph before, but if you take a look at the dark line, it shows that in the middle, so we're now here, 2018, 2019, population of Greater Melbourne is sitting at 5 million. And so this is the latest data that's come out in 2019 from the Victorian Government in terms of population projections. So this is up to date. And so the population of Greater Melbourne is projected to go to 9 million. So that's in the lifetime of a lot of us. So I drew this little emoji thing on there it's actually to remind myself, because I find it absolutely mind-boggling. So I have 2 little kids. So basically within my own lifetime, when I'm in my late 70s, my kids have grown up, they might have kids of their own, that's when we're going to hit that doubling of population. So it's huge. It's not some sort of far off, years and years ahead, future generations type thing that we're talking about here. So as you can guess, this is going to have quite large implications for our environment, including the health of our waterways. And that's not even factoring in the impact of climate change as well, which I'm sure Tim and Michelle are going to talk a little bit more about around sort of what's actually going to happen to the health of our waterways under a business as usual scenario. This little diagram on the left-hand side there is taken from the Healthy Waterway Strategy. So the Healthy Waterway Strategy, through Melbourne Water's work, did a whole lot of work around what are the projections for a whole range of aspects of waterway health, including the biodiversity. And that's an example of some of the modelling outputs where we can sort of see that there's going to be a whole lot of more sort of red on that graph over the next 50 years. So the sort of things that the Healthy Waterway Strategy talked about in terms of business as usual scenarios is that things such as we're going to see the length of the region's rivers in poor to very poor condition increase quite significantly over the next 50 years. This will have impacts, as you can imagine, on the range of services that we expect our waterways to provide to us. So not only the health of all the little critters living in there, but also our ability to go canoeing and paddling and enjoy those waterways, to see nice, lovely, looking environments as we cycle along or walk along. Impacts on cultural values. So these waterways are incredibly important to the traditional owners across the region, as you can imagine, and also economic values too. The other aspect that we often don't think about is the impact on Port Phillip Bay. So this is a photo on the right-hand side of a plume from the Yarra in 2011. So quite a significant storm event or series of storm events that happened that led to a whole lot of sediment and other sort of forms of pollution flowing out into Port Phillip Bay. So we can sort of see that this is an issue that we need to be thinking about in terms of impacts on the bay and the valleys of the bay and our ability to go swimming in a nice sort of lovely beach area. But our challenge is this is not really what we want. So we hear time and time again through various consultation that government does and through Melbourne Water's own consultation that communities actually want their waterways to continue to be as they are, and if not, improve. So communities are worried about litter, they're worried about all those things that are currently they're sort of seeing, and so really they actually want to see an improvement as opposed to a decline. So that's the big challenge, and we know that from all the work we've done, there'll be a significant amount of dollars and effort required to just keep them the way they are, let alone improve them. So what's the role of government within this? The fundamental one is the authorising environment. So the fact that we're even doing a healthy waterway strategy comes down from the Water Act. So the Water Act 1989 is a piece of really important legislation for Victoria, and one of the requirements within that Water Act is that Melbourne Water and catchment management authorities throughout Victoria prepare regional waterway strategies. And so those regional waterway strategies are statutory plans underneath the Water Act. They're approved by the Minister. And they're really about understanding what are we shooting for here, what are we aiming for, and how do we coordinate our efforts to achieve those goals that the community and the partners in government have agreed on. The way that those strategies are done is guided by our Victorian Waterway Management Strategy, which is refreshed every 8 years. So that's basically, gives effect to the Water Act or the waterway health components of the Water Act. So it sets out a whole range of policies and a whole range of actions that need to be done over that 8-year period. And one of the chapters of that actually guides how regional waterway management should be done and how regional waterway strategy should be prepared by Melbourne Water in this region and by catchment management authorities across the other regions of Victoria. So that's a big part of the team that I work in. Our role is actually supporting and working with the CMAs and Melbourne Water on those regional waterway strategies. There's a whole range of other supporting legislation as well, which I won't go into, but there's a whole lot of other things that really point to the need to be managing waterway health and managing the impacts on marine environments. The other role of government is really sort of setting out an ambitious policy agenda in various areas and really providing that enabling environment, whether it's coordination, whether it's dollars, a whole range of things. An example of this is the government currently has a water plan called Water for Victoria, and that really lays out policy directions for a whole range of aspects of water management that the current government is seeking to improve and address. And related to that, there's a whole lot of initiatives underway in the water space. I've just listed some of them here. And all of these initiatives that I've listed here will also help give effect to achieving the goals of the Healthy Waterway Strategy. Things such as the Central Region Sustainable Water Strategy, so that's a strategy that DELP is leading the development of. So it's a separate strategy to the Healthy Waterway Strategy, but it's very, very complementary because it will be about looking at the water resources and how we manage those, and how we manage those impacts on waterway health from water supply. There's the Integrated Water Management Framework, which is again something that DELP is leading and basically running a whole series of forums and developing strategic direction statements with councils and water corps to think about how do we achieve integrated water management, how do we provide water supply, stormwater, wastewater to our growing regional cities and towns and metropolitan Melbourne, and how do we think about waterway health when we do that. And two other areas are the Yarra Strategic Plan and the Waterways of the West initiatives, which again are quite complementary but separate activities to the Healthy Waterway Strategy, but they're really looking at the waterways but also more broadly at planning along that riverside corridor to manage impacts on waterways. Three other things I'll just mention as well that are quite complementary that DELP is leading is there's a range of policy work being done in the litter space. So the litter is something that communities are quite concerned about, both within metropolitan Melbourne as well as in other regional cities across Victoria. So the government's been doing some work around managing litter and waste, plastic pollution, banning single-use plastic bags, and so those things should assist the implementation of the Healthy Waterway Strategy. The final one is climate change. So you may know that there's a Climate Change Act. There's a new climate change strategy being developed by the Victorian Government and a range of adaptation planning work that's happening. And just finally, Rob asked me to talk about what DELP sees as the key benefit of the Healthy Waterway Strategy. I think this particular one, it's as Gerald said, it's about harnessing collective action. So I think this strategy really needs to be thinking about what are all the different levers that we need to pull to address this challenge? Because as I said, it's a big challenge for Melbourne Water to do on their own, and we really need to be thinking about what are all the things we need to be undertaking. And so it's a fantastic way of doing that and getting all the partners on board. And being really clear around what are the goalposts that we're shooting for and collectively understanding how we're tracking against those.
I like that last comment, a problem shared is a problem solved. Very nice. And this co-development aspect of the strategy has been very powerful, and our next speaker has been an important contributor to that process, Rosemary Hancock. Rosemary is the Manager of Water and Public Health at the Municipal Association of Victoria. And during her time there, she's been involved in a variety of policy areas, ranging from regulatory reform and interaction between federal, state and local governments. In the water portfolio, she has many responsibilities, but in water, her priorities are guided by how more effective water management can contribute to the livability of communities now and into the future. Rosemary, welcome, and look forward to your presentation.
Well, good evening, everybody. And look, MAV is really pleased to be part of the Healthy Waterways Strategy development, and then going into the future, its implementation as well over the next 10 decades to come. And the reason that we are so pleased to be part of this approach is because of the huge challenges that the Greater Melbourne City is facing. And, you know, seeing that photo that DELP provided about that big bloom from heading into Port Phillip Bay is just a classic example of why local government has a big interest in this. Now, to sort of risk stating the obvious, but it is an important point, councils have so many roles in or impact water management for the greater city. In the Greater Melbourne area, we've got 38 councils in particular, but you know these issues are actually going across the whole state in various guises. And it's interesting because the MAV, we have a board of 13 councillors from across the whole state, and water is something they continually seek briefings about in a whole range of different areas. And so I just thought it is worth just touching bases to this integrated role of councils and their interest. They're a planning authority, they approve all these developments that are taking place. They're responding to this rapid urbanisation of Melbourne. They're an open space manager, all the public roads for a start, which are major transmitters of stormwater and runoff, apart from, what are done by Vic Roads, but, there's many done by councils. They're a regulator, infrastructure provider, again in the open space area, as you would all know. They're also an emergency manager and response and recovery player as well, and they're a significant water user. I am, though, going to talk about their role as a drainage infrastructure provider. And this is a map of the Greater Melbourne area, and this is really instructive because all the pink is actually council drainage infrastructure. There's about 27 or 25,000 kilometres of it sitting under Greater Melbourne. A lot of this was actually designed, as you would know, over 100 years ago, put in place, get water out of the, urban landscape as quickly as you can, get it out to the bay, send all that pollution into those big systems and, get rid of it from the landscape. The blue ones are Melbourne water, obviously, but clearly there's huge connection between all of this. And one of the challenges facing local government at the moment with this rapid urbanisation, and I know Amber talked about some of the population projections. One of the ABS projections is that in 8 years' time, by 2027, Melbourne potentially could be 6.2 million people. Now, that's only 8 years away. That's not even our grandchildren yet. That's actually us. And all these pink bits are having to respond to that. It's a major infrastructure exercise to actually turn around an approach where particularly stormwater management can be done really effectively and but also leave water in the environment. I mean, the whole approach of moving to water-sensitive urban design does come back to council's role as a planning manager, open space manager, and one of the big trends going on at local government at the moment, with many councils leading this area and being very innovative, is in water-sensitive urban design. And there's a real demand from local government, as you would know, to do more in this area and explore those innovations to a much greater extent. They can't do it on their own, of course. So that's where the Healthy Water Strategy comes into play in terms of those partnerships with state agencies, but it's also private providers and landowners, and it is the community as well. And so that's why, as MAV, we've been really pleased to be part of the regional group, so that where there are issues relating to the 38 councils in the Greater Melbourne area, we can then work out ways to sort of resolve them reasonably speedily. And I have taken this, actually, it was a discussion paper for the Water Victoria paper before it was finalised, but it does go, councils are intimately interested in going from the drain city, which Melbourne has been in the past, ultimately to a water-sensitive city. And really, climate change and the need to adapt is probably making that more urgent. And so, therefore, we do need to think a bit differently about those institutional arrangements and how, say, councils and the state agencies dealt Melbourne Water, but also private individuals and whatever as well work together. So I just thought I'd give that very brief overview for you, stating the obvious. Many of you will be aware of that, but it is important, and I think that bottom-up, top-down approach will be very useful for in the implementation of this strategy. Having the 5 catchments with their individually developed visions is really important. The 5 catchments generally have about 5 to 6 councils within them, so there's a lot more regional collaboration going on within local government as well. And it will really help those upstream, downstream issues. Councils are actually, their borders are designed about, population and boating patterns and things like that. They're not actually created based on where water goes. And so there are going to be conversations over the next, period about how do you get optimal attention to particularly, say, stormwater management upstream rather than it all ending down in the bays and the oceans. So, huge challenges, but we're actually very excited to be part of this project ongoing endeavour, and it'll be great to also have all of you be involved in all of that as well as we go through the next decade.
It's just been great getting the input from Delp and Mav on this, and also the really valuable input from the EPA and Parks Victoria and the Port Phillip and Western Port Catchment Authority, all of whom are playing a really important role in the co-development and co-delivery of this strategy. Another aspect that I really like about the Healthy Waterways strategy is how the thing is actually founded on a bit of science, some good science. And our next two speakers are going to draw attention to some of that. The first is Michelle Dixon. Michelle is currently the chair of the Strategy Science Panel, and she's an independent consultant with a focus on strategy evaluation and collaboration, and she's got quite an interest in waterway and coastal and catchment management issues. She specialises in participatory processes that bring together policy science and community perspectives to inform decision making, and hence really a good fit for this strategy. So Michelle, welcome, and look forward to
Thanks, Rob. I'll just make sure you can hear me. So I wanted to open with this diagram. Oh, you can't see the diagram. I wanted to open with this diagram. Has anyone seen this before? Hands up. One person. Okay, so have I got a room of scientists and engineers, I'm guessing? Are there any designers? Are there any creative types? Are there any dancers or singers? No. So you're probably used to processes being represented by flowcharts and concept diagrams, linear things that happen in an orderly way. Well, co-design doesn't happen like that. Co-design is a creative and participatory process. And it kind of starts in an area in the space of mess and uncertainty, where solutions become clearer over time. And I think that's a really important thing to understand as we start to talk about some of the science, because science has had to find its way in this process. It's always had an important role. That was always the intent of Rob Considine, who was the lead for this process. But he also made it very clear that science needed to respond to the co-design process. Science wasn't leading the process. And for the science panel who supported this project and the development of the strategy, that was a really big thing for us to get our heads around. So after this seminar, you can look up the design squiggle and hear a bit more about it. But I love using this because it really represents some of the messy situations and processes we get into when we're doing collaborative planning. So what is the science panel? The Science Panel is a skills-based advisory group with a mix of experienced practitioners, consultants, policymakers and academics. And for my sins, because I was the one that suggested we have a science panel, I'm now chairing it. So I've made it through 2 iterations, and I'm pleased to see tonight a number of the science panel members who come from a wide range of backgrounds. We, as I said earlier, we consider and provide advice to Melbourne really on technical and science-based matters. We're not here to contribute actually to the co-design process other than in that aspect. We first contributed through the development of the Healthy Waterways strategy, and now we're considering and grappling with the MERI strategy. So the advice is provided directly to the Melbourne Water Project team, but we also have a line of communication with Rob and the regional leadership group. The panel membership, in terms of reference, is adaptive, much like the strategy itself. And so membership will change over the life of the strategy as it transitions from developing the strategy through to coming up with the MERI plan and then into the implementation phase. So where does the science panel fit in the strategy process? Well, obviously it underpins the whole thing, but really it's right here in the middle. And the science in the strategy ranges from world-class sophisticated models, conceptual understanding of systems, expert opinion, and monitoring and data. But as you can see, and as I'll continue to point home, it's an input to decision making. It's not the decision itself. So, what were some of the questions that we grappled with as a science panel? We grappled with, is the logic of the strategy clear? Are there any errors in the science underpinning the Healthy Waterways strategy? Is it clear what is feasible under future trajectories? And in that, we were really thinking about the population growth that Amber presented earlier and the predictions around climate change. And so we wanted to understand, are the assumptions within the strategy, are they well defined and clear? And at the time that Ian was chairing the panel, this was something he drove home often with the panel. So we had 5 and 6 hour marathon sessions to thrash this out. So you can imagine there was a lot of hearty debate. And I think that's something that the science panel really brought to this process in terms of debating the science, really collaboratively coming to the science and not being afraid to pull things apart and put them back together again. And I really congratulate Melbourne Water for allowing themselves and their consultants to be opened up to such scrutiny. So some of the tools that we explicitly reviewed and critiqued were conceptual models for the way that wetlands, estuaries and rivers function and the relationship between Melbourne's key values that it uses to set targets and the condition that support those values. Habitat suitability models and zonation, the use of zonation to prioritise management actions, and Tim will talk about those in much more detail shortly. The appropriateness to use expert opinion and judgments to make decisions and inform decisions, and the use of monitoring and data. And as Gerald mentioned, the use of data and expert opinion and multiple lines of evidence will become increasingly important in the implementation phase in order to track progress towards outcomes. So one of the big challenges for the science panel was the use of 6 environmental and 3 social key values to set long-term targets for waterways. So how best to represent these values? What metrics, what data, what approaches should be used? How to represent and plan for waterways as systems when we were dealing with waterways represented as rivers, estuaries and wetlands, separate assets. What are the appropriate temporal and spatial scales for planning and target setting? Ensuring those future impacts are understood, and as I'll come back to again and again, understanding the co-design process and where does science fit in that. So my last 2 slides are really a bit of a synopsis. So what was the good in the science? We really did explicitly see in the Healthy Waterways strategy threats from climate change and urbanisation considered in a scenario planning process. We can see headwater streams, those small, intermittently flowing streams that sometimes don't even look like a stream, they just look like a swampy meadow. Estuaries and wetlands finally get some airtime in the Healthy Waterways strategy. The evidence for informing the setting of long-term targets for some values is much better, particularly where the habitat suitability models have helped inform scenario planning. And I guess heartwarming for all of you in the room, now that I know you're all scientists and engineers, is there was a huge appetite for the science products and tools that were presented in co-design. And so people want to know that decision-making is being informed by the best possible evidence, and that's a great thing. So what's the work in progress? Well, the work in progress is that even though they got more airtime, we're still not really thinking and planning for rivers, estuaries and wetlands as integrated, interdependent systems. So we've still got work to do there. Planning and target setting for social and economic and cultural values, still some work to do there, particularly for economic and cultural values. Social values had some social science underpinning, but the other two spaces are still in development. The relationship between the science inputs and the co-design process for the Healthy Waterways strategy was quite complex and multi-layered, and at times we scratched our head to know where co-design was going. But that's just because we were scientists wanting that linear process mapped out in a flowchart. But further developing tools such as structured decision making would really help in the next iteration of the Healthy Waterways strategy. It would help make it more transparent and improve confidence, both in co-design but also in the science and the use of science. Tackling trade-offs in the strategy process, still some way to go. We need to accept that you can't always balance values. Sometimes hard decisions need to be made. Demonstrating progress towards long-term strategy targets. These are 50-year targets. So during the life of the strategy, the targets for values, we need to temper our enthusiasm for seeing great change in 8 years. And finally, building the practice of multidisciplinary thinking, informed by data, information and knowledge. So the science panel built on a history with the first Healthy Waterways strategy of using technical expertise. This brought people together in a really structured process, and Melbourne Water were open to it. And so much like the co-design process has wrapped its arms around a whole range of stakeholders, we need to continue to do that with the science panel process. Thanks, Rob.
Great, you've set the scene really nicely for our last speaker, who's Tim Fletcher. Tim's a Professor of Urban Ecohydrology at the University of Melbourne. He's internationally regarded for his expertise in waterway and stormwater management, and I'm sure he's known to many of you in this room. His research focus includes urban hydrology, stormwater quality and the design and performance of stormwater treatment and harvesting systems, and he currently leads the Waterway Research Practice Partnership at the University of Melbourne. Tim, great pleasure to have you here. Please bring us home with the last bit of science.
Thank you very much, Rob. So, as Michelle and Rob have alluded to, I'm here to talk a little bit about the science tools that have informed the strategy, and particularly two tools. I want to acknowledge the people who did this work, because it's not me. So I'm presenting on behalf of a team led by Chris Walsh and Jung and Chi. I think Chris is even in the audience, having just flown back in. Now, you might be wondering what this little picture refers to. Is this anyone's favourite song? Boston's More Than a Feeling? No, clearly not. It's definitely my favourite. No, probably not mine either. But thinking about what's different about this strategy compared to the last one, and I was quite heavily involved in the last one. The last one, as Michelle alluded to, really depended a lot on expert opinion, conceptual models that were kind of thrashed out in a room of people who are experts, but of course, full of biases and unknown biases. And the tools that were developed this time by Chris and Jung and the team really allow us to use a comprehensive set of data to inform predictive models. Now, of course, those models have their own uncertainties, but at least here we have some objective and transparent process that allows us to start setting priorities. The Melbourne region is really lucky, in fact, to have a huge set of biological data that can inform such analyses. Many cities around the world don't have such a thing. And a whole lot of matching environmental data for things like climates, stormwater inputs, imperviousness, etc., that allow you to then say, well, if climate changes, how will those biological entities change? If urbanisation continues, how will they change, etc.? And so the first tool, and I suppose the backbone of that tool, of that work, is the habitat suitability models, which were developed by macroinvertebrates. Developed for macroinvertebrates, fish, and platypus. I was stuck on trying to make a pun of backbone and macroinvertebrates, and that distracted me. My own fault. And so those habitat suitability models were developed for each of those organism types, allowing predictions to be made about future states. So those models work by taking that biological data, taking the environmental predictors, and then testing various models. So testing which are the factors that are driving those those biological variables, which ones are most plausible, and once those models are selected, they can then be validated and tested, and that allows the team to say, okay, so if we increase the amount of imperviousness, for example, by 20%, and it's done the same way we've done it for the last 20 years, as was referred to here, discharging it, getting rid of that water, what's going to happen? What species are we going to lose? What families are going to lose? What areas that currently have platypus won't have? So those models were developed, for example, for platypus, as I've described, and so you can see that in the future scenarios, if we continue developing things that way, just discharging of stormwater like it's a nuisance, we'll have increasing areas where we don't where our diversity and population of macroinvertebrates is very low, whereas essentially it's degraded. Similarly for platypus, we can see that we'll start to have more and more reaches, such as around here, where we see platypus, where we're not going to see them anymore, where they're going to disappear. So this is really helpful for then a co-developed strategy for Melbourne Water, the community, all of the partners involved in that strategy to make decisions about, well, is that a future we want or not? And we've heard already today that it's a future that most people don't want. That habitat suitability model is useful, but then you want to turn that into actions. And so the zonation tool is designed to do that. It takes those models and then informs an analysis of, well, what actions will deliver what benefits and what costs will they be? And if you think about those three questions, in fact, that's basically the backbone again. I'm stuck on that word, still searching for a pun. That's the backbone of a strategy. What actions am I going to do? What benefits will they have? Perhaps where am I going to do them as well? And what will they cost? So, for various things that I could do, for example, I could change forest cover by doing riparian revegetation works. I could deal with this impervious impact by much better management of stormwater, trying to restore a more natural flow and water quality regime. I can deal with barriers that impact fish communities by installing fishways, etc. So zonation allows me to test in a spatially explicit way, so knowing where it's happening, what benefits I'll get from different implementation scenarios. And again, test it on the back of models developed from a really comprehensive set of data. So, what actions are we going to take? So these are all the scenario codes, so the sort of action codes. I won't go through them all. Where we're going to do them, and then looking at what impact is this going to have on various values in different catchments. So finally you have this nice transparent process from the biological data you've spent a lot of time and money collecting to predictions of, if I do this, I will have this impact. And if you think about a co-delivered strategy, that's really what we want, because everyone wants to decide what things are going to be important based on some sense of knowing that it's going to deliver a benefit. In my view, and I say this as someone who wasn't involved in the work, I really think this is quite a breakthrough, and I think it's a breakthrough in allowing the community to have kind of confidence that when we're spending their money, because ultimately it is, we're spending it based on the best available evidence. Thanks a lot.
I must say it was really invigorating to see when we actually ran these catchment forums to see how the community lapped up this stuff. They were keenly interested in this, and it was really motivating for them, I felt, to actually see some kind of hard data behind this and really got them on board. Can I invite the speakers to go up and take a seat, and we'll move to questions. I might actually ask one of my own, because I feel there's a bit of a gap in this, and I'm going to ask this one of you, Gerald, that one thing I think we haven't really covered is dimensioning the portfolio of activity that is likely to ensue over the next decade as this strategy is implemented, the scale of investment, the likely number of projects and so on. You can speak from a Melbourne Water perspective, of course, but there'll be other agencies that are investing as well. But can you begin at least by giving the audience a bit of a sense of the scale of investment and activity?
So probably starting with the beginning, our current investment on healthy waterways strategies ranges around about $25 million a year. That's based on the current strategy and current programs of work, which are, by the way, collaborative and co-delivered. Melbourne Water works with a lot of partners on a range of waterway strategies, which are tended to focus around vegetation, rehabilitation of things like fish ladders, work around stormwater management. But again, as I mentioned before, focused more on projects rather than programs that look at the entirety of subcatchments across 5 catchments. So we are going through a planning process at the moment for a thing called a pricing submission, which is basically our business plan for 5 years to submit to the Essential Services Commission. And the work that's been done on co-design as part of this study gives us some really important hard data about what planning looks like. So the planning is happening as we speak based on the work that's done from this strategy and the prioritisation of the catchments based on catchments that are at risk of degradation, that the panel and the co-design process is identified needs to be either stabilised or improved, feed into that process of development of projects. So don't ask me to quote the number, but the expectation is that when we finish the volume of work which will be occurring over the next 4 to 5 months, we'll be in a position to have developed a program for the first 5 years of what will be, as I said, a multi-decade plan, and then testing the public's appetite to pay for that is part of the next process, going through the regulatory process, getting approval for spending. So, as I said, it's building on current projects, rolling them out into programs based on prioritisation, activities and outcomes from the strategy.
Great, thanks, Gerald. Tim and Michelle, I suspect this one's for one of you. There's a question here about the data infrastructure. Is it, mature enough to support this adaptive management challenge in the strategy?
Data management is one of the key considerations in the monitoring, evaluation, reporting and improvement framework. As you can imagine, with a co-designed and co-delivered strategy, there's going to be a range of, data warehousing and data platforms that will need to come together over the next 12 to 18 months. And certainly the Melbourne Water team at the moment are thinking about the performance objectives and how they collect data and report on performance objectives, because that'll be occurring in an annual time space. Tim, you may want to talk a bit about the data for the models and how that is housed. I'm not sure.
I'm looking at my colleague Chris Walsh, who promised he'd save me if I couldn't answer. So as I understand it, so nod either way, Chris, the team is continuing developing the models, trying to do so for more species, etc., and of course to validate them further. And for example, you might eventually want to do such a model for water quality, but it's quite difficult. So data is always a challenge for us, but I think we're also getting to a point where a lot of data has been collected and from multiple parties, and we're getting better sort of sharing of that data now, so it's easier.
Okay, that's great. Thanks.
Because maybe to add to that, one of the challenges from an implementation perspective is that there are data sources from most of the key partners who are part of the strategy. So getting alignment around common measurement systems and making sure that we record data in a consistent way, that we integrate that data so that we have a program view as opposed to a bunch of projects or a bunch of programs from partners, so that we get that oversight to allow the science review and feedback is a big operational challenge, if you like. So that's an important part of this as well.
A good question here about interannual variability. I thought of something similar to this myself today when we were discussing the MERI. The question goes, what goes on in a waterway depends on the year-to-year weather. How will you separate weather effects from underlying changes caused by interventions?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. The statement is true. And the challenge of modelling always is to tease out, which of those effects which of the levers you're pulling are having more of an impact than those climate variations. But there are modelling methods that do that, and so the habitat suitability models basically test a whole lot of models, probably hundreds of models, with various combinations of those driving variables, including things like flow in the last 6 months, temperature in the last 6 months, temperature in the last 2 years, amount of imperviousness, various things, and they determine which of those is the most plausible of those models. So that's not to say only one model is right, but based on the data, which has the strongest association with the variables you're interested in. And so, environmental science, that's always the problem we're dealing with. And often climate is a huge driver. In hydrology, for example, it's got the huge lever, and the things we do tend to be relatively small levers, but they're still important, and they're still statistically significant and tell us we're on the right track. So, it makes our job harder, but it's also what makes it fun.
Right. Another good question here about environmental degradation and the likelihood that as habitats are degraded, they're replaced by invasive species. And the question's really wondering what's the implications of this, and does that make the task much harder, and how do you handle it?
The answer is yes. So again, it's the engineer speaking, so bear with me, but the answer is yes. And I think probably one of the areas where there's been a lot of work done around healthy waterways in the past is in vegetation management, riparian vegetation rehabilitation. So I think has been a lot of work done, a lot of experience gained in this area. But yes, it will become one of those ever-increasing challenges that we'll need to face in the delivery of the strategy.
Guy that was doing my fencing the other day actually does some work on alligator weed removal. He was telling me all about it. It was rather interesting. Okay. Yeah, please. Yeah, go ahead.
Just wanted to mention a related government initiative that DELP's leading is the Port Phillip Bay Environmental Management Plan, which did look at some concerns around that. So there is some science research that was uncovered as part of that science review, in terms of that we need to be thinking about pollution coming from waterways in terms of nutrients and sediment, particularly nutrients into Port Phillip Bay. So certainly within that Port Phillip Bay Environmental Management Plan, it was something that's been flagged as keeping an eye on in terms of marine pests in the bay, and the issue of just understanding what may happen with increased nutrients into the bay to marine pests, because already we have a large number of marine pests in Port Phillip Bay. So it's certainly something that DELP is actively keeping an eye on, and through that Port Phillip Bay plan, working up the catchment with Melbourne Water on strategies to try and minimise increases in nutrients going into the bay.
Great, thanks, Amber. Good question here about the concerns of traditional owners. Will these be prioritised? I suppose Gerald and Amber, maybe you could have a go at this. Traditional owners, will their concerns be recognised and dealt with?
So let me start the answer to that question. as I think I emphasise quite strongly, the importance of governance and alignment is, I think, essential to the success of this strategy, certainly long term. As I said, we're talking about decades here, not years. The traditional owners have a role to play as part of the regional leadership group. They are a key partner in that group. They're also a key source of knowledge and also engagement with the community. So Melbourne Water has quite a strong engagement program with traditional owners across an array of areas, but the waterway strategy is an important part of that. So that's an ongoing conversation. We're still working through what that looks like as we land implementation. Our view is that implementation starts over the next 3 or 4 months, as in we've gone through a change process. We've spent a lot of time communicating with stakeholders, including traditional owners, about what that looks like, and then we need to start the new way of working, and then start to learn and be adaptive. But traditional owners have been an important part of the development of the strategy from day one.
And related to that, there's a lot happening in this space, particularly around the Yarra and the Waterways of the West. So some of you may be aware there was a Yarra Protection Act that came out not long ago, and that Yarra Protection Act now is really driving a whole lot of work to give a greater voice to traditional owners, the Wurundjeri around the Yarra catchment. So there's a Birrarung Council, which traditional owners are a key part of. The Wurundjeri have also put out their water policy, and so through the Yarra Strategic Plan, there'll actually be a whole lot of work done to understand and really reflect the community vision and also the Wurundjeri water policy goals in the Yarra Strategic Plan. So there's a lot of separate work that's happening, which is a bit broader than the Healthy Waterway Strategy in terms of its scope, because it's looking at land use planning as well as waterway health. But there's certainly a lot of work happening in the Yarra to give a greater voice to traditional owners for the management of the Yarra, and conversely also for the waterways to the west. So for the Maribyrnong catchment and the other rivers in the western part of Melbourne, again, there's work being done to develop a community vision for those waterways, which really picks up what came out of the Healthy Waterway Strategy, but also, again, looks at broader values around that river, the riverside corridors, and then from off the back of that there'll be work done to then reflect the community vision and what the traditional owners value for those western waterways in actions going forward that are collaborative actions across government, Water Corps, Melbourne Water and others.
Another interesting question here about how this dovetails in with other plans and whether there's any interaction and competition, and reference has been made, for instance, to the Yarra Strategic Plan and the Birrarung Act Council. Are there issues with competition for resources? Is this messy or synergistic, would you say?
I haven't had any direct involvement with the Yarra Strategic Plan. So Amber, do you want to have a crack at that one?
So personally, I haven't been intimately involved in the Yarra Strategic Plan. It's happening through a different part of DELP. However, I understand that what's coming through so far is really emphasising some of the existing goals. So I guess it's not sort of conflicting with what has coming out of the other community consultation that's happened to date. It's really emphasising the importance of protecting environmental health of our waterways and protecting those important values along the sides of the rivers as well. So it's not really throwing up any additional conflicting uses. It's more sort of emphasising what needs to be done. So, but again, I probably can't comment in detail around that.
I can probably comment actually, because in the development of the strategy, we decided to defer to the Yarra Strategic planning process. So rather than to have a completely different bespoke scoping process for the Yarra catchment, we lent on that. So hopefully I'm confident that the two things are well aligned. Amber, this is slightly tangential, I think, to our topic, but it's highly rated as a question, so I'm going to ask it. Why is the Water Act of 1989 so old? I guess because it's 1989, but it is 30 years old. Melbourne and the environment have changed significantly. Are all the fundamental policies in the Act still relevant? Is it a tired old Act that needs polishing, or is it just fine?
I guess what I will say is that there are always opportunities to amend parts of the Act, and again, that's happened in the past, and you know, there are amendments underway at the moment that are being looked at. So I think, you know, over time there has been, and there will continue to be opportunities to amend those acts to reflect those changes. So as I said, yes, certainly that's being looked at the moment. You know, within the current government, there's a range of sort of things and components that could be tweaked and could be re-looked at. And you know, the government is going through a process of considering what they do want to tackle in the next 4 years as part of that. So that's always on the cards. But in terms of overhauling the whole thing, at this stage, as I'm far aware, it's not on the cards, but certainly amendments.
Good. This is a comment rather than a question, but people are pleased to see gender equity on the panel, as am I. Wonderful. What would you do differently if you had the chance to develop the strategy again? Oh, God, we only finished the first one. The last one, I should say. But I wonder whether, you know, Rosemary, you were there from the very beginning. Would you offer any perspective on that?
Well, I've actually enjoyed the process personally because it's been a fabulous way having exposure to all the really insightful, particularly the scientific knowledge, the team at Melbourne Water, and having access to that from an outside perspective has enabled our work within local government to be a lot stronger. So I actually don't really have suggestions for improvements right at this point, because to me it's actually been quite a step change from the past anyway. So I'd more reflect that I think the challenge now, though, is, and hopefully the strategy and its design will enable this, is that we actually keep the enthusiasm, and also it has the structures within it, or I'm feeling very positive about it, to be able to keep people motivated out there in the community, within councils and all the other players, Parks Victoria, EPA and all of those agencies, to keep trying to address things as quickly as we can. Because I think, you know, the pressures facing Melbourne are going to require that speed and attention. And, you know, look, one of the issues for local government, I think, and we're making it sound easy, but actually it's not. Because, for example, all this open data and transparency is actually also very confronting at times. And I think, therefore, the co-design process is so important because the community is involved as well, and they will have greater insight to why decisions are being made. And in particular, for example, council's role in deciding, as a planning authority, deciding flooding overlays is a hugely contentious issue. It affects property values, you know, and a lot of people don't want overlays to come in because they don't want their properties to go down in value. So it actually is it's a complex thing, you know. It sounds easy, but actually it's not. And I think having the structure around all of that will enable that progress to keep pushing on, which it has to do. So I don't actually have changes to suggest at the minute, but I think it's because we're about to embark on this big trek, you know, and hopefully we've got the good packing done and we're all well prepared. But certainly it's been a really interesting process.
I reckon we do. That's a good segue to this. Yep, go ahead, Gerald.
We're just about to launch, so it's a bit early to about thinking about learnings. But what I would say is that the framework that's been proposed to implement this strategy, which is the collective impact model, which I sort of went through in some detail, I think has the potential, if it delivers, and it's one of the better models I've seen, has the potential to be applied to flood strategy, to land management more generally, to catchments, and where any issue where there are multiple entities involved in accountability for management, and there are lots of them everywhere you turn. We're having to deal with that. So hopefully it's a way of working across the barriers, the silos that naturally create within organisations. So I'm pretty optimistic that this model kicks, and I think it will, it could be a new way of working in the government space. So.
Our hottest running question here is council responsibility for catchments under 60 hectares is being reviewed now. What is the likely outcome and implications for the strategy?
Question. As you know, the Victorian floodplain strategy, when it came out a couple of years ago, committed the state government to reviewing the institutional arrangements between Melbourne Water and the 38 councils. And as all of you are no doubt aware, that 60 hectare delineation. MAV, DELP and Melbourne Water, we've had sort of exchanges of correspondence a couple of years ago as part of the implementation of that review to collectively work together. I think the underlying principle is that there is a need for change in sense of, it actually is extraordinary when we talk about legislation. There are no requirements on councils to do stormwater management. There are enabling provisions in the Local Government Act, but really there's nothing saying councils must do anything actually. The fact is they do it, and in fact Melbourne, has a very successful city, most livable city, in the world, although I think we've just lost that status. But, we're right up there in world terms, so the system has worked. The question is, though, what do we need in the future? And so for us as MAV and local government, again, this question of 38 autonomous organisations doing certain activities within their little boundary is going to benefit from having a look at the institutional arrangements, and foundational work has already been done over the last 18 months or so. We're very pleased actually this week that a steering committee has been reformed again and it's sort of kicking off again. There's actually a lot of work to do though with councils in particular, obviously with Melbourne Water and DELP. So we can't promise quick action, but certainly it's alive again, and our work over the next year is actually to come up with sort of options and obviously analyse them and work out how they're optimally agreed and will work. So there's a bit of intense work to happen, I hope, over the next year, but certainly it is on government's agenda, and that's a positive thing.
Thanks, Rosemary. We've got one more question, and I'm really pleased to ask this one because it speaks to the catchment forums, which I don't think we've really covered in much depth today. But the question is, what part do communities play in this strategy, especially considering citizen science groups and Friends of Creek groups?
So a big input into the whole co-design of the Healthy Waterway strategies was engagement with the community, and the creation of the 5 catchment implementation forums is a vital part of the delivery mechanism. One of the initial conversations we had when my team took custody of the strategy for implementation was, what does governance look like? And what we landed on is what I presented, which was a single point of focus for governance at the highest level. But at a community level and the catchment level, the catchment forums are vital for a couple of reasons. Firstly, they are a conduit for information flow, not only information on what's happening with the program, as in all of the program from all the partners, in terms of what is being delivered, what is the latest feedback from the MERI, as in the latest data, what is that showing us? Short term will be catchment conditions, longer term will be how are the performance objectives changing and ultimately the value shifting, but also an opportunity for the community to look at that data and have an opportunity to give feedback on what they see, and even an opportunity to look at, we'll look at this on perhaps meetings every twice a year. We'll have an opportunity to meet with these catchment forums, to share information, to get feedback, and to give the community with their key partners. And Melbourne Water does this anyway, but this is a turbocharged version of that. to give the community an opportunity to give feedback on what they see, and particularly what's being proposed for the next tranche of projects and programs. So it's a vital two-way piece of communication. And it's also a chance to share on some of the work that comes out of the science panel, where we go, oh my God, I think we've just found something that's going to help us. The sharing of that information, and ultimately the communication of that across those catchment forums. It will evolve in terms of the roles, but it's a vital connection back to the people who really helped drive this from a grassroots level.
Or, oh my God, we found a bug in the model.
Or, oh my God, there's a bug in the model, surprise, surprise, but we fixed it. So.
Great, thank you, Gerald. Look, would you join me in thanking all of the speakers today? Thank you also for your attendance and for your great questions. They're really appreciated. My last duty really is just to let you know that the next Water Security Series seminar will be on Wednesday the 18th of September, back in this room as it happens. And the topic is Contaminants of Emerging Concern, and that will be led by Professor Peter Scales from the University of Melbourne, and presumably another panel of wise sages. I hope you'll join us for that. Thanks for coming.